Welcome to today's webinar, What I Need to Know About Clinical Trials. We have had some technical difficulties in the background, so we may or may not have Spanish captions available. We will be posting a link in the Zoom chat, and fingers crossed that the captions work in Spanish as well as English. If you're watching this recording at a later time, you will find instructions in the video description on how to activate the subtitles in both English and Spanish. Thank you very much to our sponsor, Biogen, without whom the webinar series that the Alliance offers would not be possible. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy Cummings, Executive Director of the International Alliance, and I'm joined today by an incredible panel who will share with us some information on what we should know and understand when considering clinical trials. This webinar will focus on understanding more about clinical trials, but we will not be addressing specific trials within this webinar. We have a wonderful panel today with Rachael Marsden, moderating. I combined those two words. She is a consultant nurse at the M&D Oxford, UK, and she's been the Motor Neuron Disease Care Center coordinator for the Oxford Care Center since 2002. It is one of the largest M&D care and research centers in the UK. An interesting thing about Rachael, in addition to her professional background, is that she currently holds the world record for being the fastest woman to circumnavigate the globe on a tandem bicycle. And if you want to look that up, look up Tandem WOW, which stands for Tandem Women on Wheels. Also, as part of our panel, we have Allison Bulat, who has a fantastic professional background, including a degree in clinical research management that she completed in 2019. Alison lost her husband to ALS in 2016 and has since committed her time and energy to helping others on the journey and doing whatever is possible to enable a cure for ALS to be found. Alison, thank you so much for turning your personal journey into dedication to helping others. In addition to her current role in patient navigation with the Healy ALS platform trial, she serves as a member of the Patient Advisory Board, EAP Advisory Board, Retention and Recruitment Committee, and Regimen A Steering Committee for the trial, and is a certified NEALS Research Ambassador. She serves as the co-chair of the NEALS Patient Education and Advocacy Committee, which is called the Peace Committee, and serves as a patient liaison to the executive leadership team of NEALS. Peer review panelist for the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, and in her local state of Arizona, she contributes to the local ALSA chapter as a board member as well. So quite an extensive resume, and we're really thrilled that Alison is part of our panel. We also have Nadia Sethi with us, who's the Director of Community Outreach and Engagement for ALS TDI, where she serves as a resource to community members seeking to learn more about the science of ALS TDI and treatments and active clinical trials. She's on the program panel for the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program for ALS and co-chair of the NEALS Patient Education and Advocacy Committee, and has served on multiple advisory panels for pharma companies. Nadia also lost her husband to ALS in 2020, and similar to Alison, has dedicated her time to helping others through their journey with ALS. Completing our panel is Paula Trefiak. Paula is a person living with ALS MND, SOD1 ALS from Regina, Saskatchewan in Canada. She's an ALS mentor with the ALS Society of Saskatchewan, an ALS clinical research ambassador with NEALS and ALS Canada, a patient community representative for the Scientific and Medical Advisory Council, and a community fellow for the International Symposium on ALS MND Research. Paula has lost dozens of family members to ALS during her lifetime, including her father, who lost his battle in September of 2009. In mid-2010, Paula started noticing signs and symptoms of the disease, and she was diagnosed with ALS in 2016. In November 2016, Paula started participating in the Biogen Valor trial, and in March 2018, she started participating in the tofersen open label extension. Since her diagnosis, one of Paula's siblings has been diagnosed with ALS as well, and also multiple cousins too. I'm going to now turn it over to Rachael Marsden, our moderator for today, and thank you in advance to all our fantastic panelists.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for those introductions. Just for those of you who aren't really familiar with MND, I'm sure many of you are, it is a neurodegenerative disease affecting all movement, speech, swallow, and breathing for some. I think the focus really is that the life expectancy can be very short and on average 3 years. So anybody thinking about joining a clinical trial, it's a massive, massive act of generosity really for that, given their time and the time that a trial takes. So a lot of consideration. Hopefully we'll be discussing some of those points now. Just to say, for anybody who has any questions, they're very welcome to write them in the chat box you'll find at the bottom of your screen. But we will have a question and answer session, which will allow you to kind of ask your questions and put them to the panel. So having said that, I have my first question for you, for the panel. And it's really, what do you think are the main problems that are really preventing us and the scientists from discovering a treatment and cure? And I'd like to ask Nadia first.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So I think that there's two main barriers to drug discovery for ALS. And one of those is heterogeneity. And heterogeneity is a big term that refers to how ALS is likely a collection of many different diseases that have the same outcome. So ALS is different in how it starts and how it progresses, and probably it's also different in the pathology that's happening from person to person. So how do we find the right drug to address that specific pathology that's happening in that person, right? That's a challenge. And one of the ways to do that would be to have biomarkers. And biomarkers are something that we would be able to measure in somebody's blood. It could be some of the genetics of that person, but it would basically give us a way to connect the right person to the right treatment. And so there's been a lot of advances in the last several years for addressing both of these measures, but those are some of the main issues that I see.
Thank you, Nadia. I think, Alison, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. As we heard from Nadia just now, there's a lot of complexity in the biology of the disease itself, more so, I think, than many other diseases, and it affects the most difficult organ in the body, right, which is our brain. So compounding that difficulty is the added complexity and actual disparity of resources, such as funding, of course, but also trained scientists in the field of ALS, clinical research sites, access to experimental therapies, and most importantly, the fact that this leads to the complexity of actually filling and completing clinical trials when participants are difficult to find or do not have access to the trials for a multitude of reasons. There are just a lot of factors in play that make ALS research very difficult, and research and clinical trials is truly the only way to find treatments and cures for ALS.
Thank you. And Paula.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Nadia and both Alison have said. You know, it's only been within the last 30 years that we've been able to identify the first ALS gene. And since then, we are continuing to discover so many more genes. And now that we know those genes, we're also trying to study, you know, what's going wrong, like Nadia said. And so that is something very, very new. And I know for me participating in the Biogen Valor trial, you know, this was one of the very first gene-specific ALS drugs to be tested. And so for me, this started in a phase 1 trial in 2016. So it's still quite recent, but we're making a lot of really good progress. And it's really exciting to see what's going to happen within the next 10, 20 years.
Yes, we're on the beginning of a great journey, I think, from that perspective. Having kind of moving on a little bit, and based on your experience of clinical trials, can you tell us in finer detail, and I'll start with Alison, can you tell us in finer detail on a micro level, kind of some of the design elements of a clinical trial?
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's important to start at the beginning and really set the stage for what a clinical trial is. So there are many types of clinical research, but a clinical trial itself is actually an experiment. So I'll let Nadia talk a little bit about how potential therapies are selected to move through the process into a trial. But once it does reach a trial, that means that the investigational product is considered ready to be tested in humans. And there's a lot to be considered when experimenting on human beings. So trials are done in phases. Phase 1 trials focus on the overall safety of the product. A company might test this on a small group of volunteers with ALS or even healthy volunteers. The goal is to make sure that humans can tolerate the substance or the procedure. So phase 2 focuses on safety and understanding the correct dosage of the experimental therapy. Phase 2 studies are generally larger and include only people with ALS. Once the safety and dosage are determined, a phase 3 trial is designed to study the actual efficacy of the product and see if it has the desired impact or effect on the disease. So based on the regulatory requirements of each country, these phases could look slightly different, and the next steps could look very different after phase 3. Some countries could require a second phase 3 study if necessary, or some could issue approval pending a post-market study, for example. But generally, trials are designed in phases to determine safety, dosage, and efficacy.
Thank you for that. Nadia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so Allison had mentioned a little bit about, how drugs are chosen to go into a trial. So it is really important that the research that is done in advance of that phase 1 trial is very strong. And that research can also determine some of the trial design. There are different ways to administer drugs depending on where we're trying to get them into the system, for example, and that can definitely affect somebody's participation in a clinical trial if somebody is willing to take, a more invasive type of treatment as intrathecal injections, for example. So those are things that would be administered into the spinal cord area so that they can kind of get straight to the brain where they need to go. So there are many, many different ways to administer treatment, and that early science has to be very strong to ensure that there's a good reason that that drug is going into a trial. I think also to consider about clinical trial design are the many different perspectives. So there's the regulatory perspective. What would make a clinical trial design favorable for a regulatory body? Their focus is going to be on whether a trial has met its goals, right? It is an experiment, as Allison was saying. And so from a regulatory perspective, from the agencies that are looking to approve our drugs, they want to see that a trial set out to do what it was meant to do, and that there were enough people in that trial to show that that effect was real. I think from a pharma and industry perspective, their goal is to design a trial that's going to lead to approval and have efficient recruitment so that they can enroll as quickly as possible. From a community perspective, from people living with ALS and their families, what would make a good clinical trial design? Well, the focus there is often on access. What is the chance for somebody to get the actual drug versus a placebo? Is there a way to continue to get a drug after the clinical trial is done through an open label extension? And this is where patient advisory boards can be key in driving a good clinical trial design. And we are seeing more and more of those, which is a wonderful thing for ALS. And this patient perspective is also something that's addressed in the patient-centric trial design ratings from IMALS. That was created back in 2020. And the patient-centric trial design ratings address some of these different aspects that are really important to the ALS community. And it addresses things like access, whether there's an expanded access program, whether there's an open label extension, how easy is it to participate in a trial? Is it something that, have there been considerations made so people don't have as many in-person visits? Are there biomarkers that are being collected? So the PACT ratings can be viewed on the IMALS website.
Thank you for that. It just occurred to me from what you're talking about biomarkers. Do you think it would be possible to design studies using biomarkers which didn't have to have a placebo effect, so that everybody would potentially get the live drug?
That would be ideal, right? And that's hopefully where we would like to get. And that is one of the reasons that it would be fantastic to have biomarkers. We would have to be pretty sure that that biomarker is really clearly showing a treatment effect for that to happen. And we would need our regulatory bodies to then be on board. So there is a lot of science that would have to happen to show that that biomarker is truly reflective of a treatment effect. But yes, that is the hope.
That would be amazing. Thank you for that. And now I think that you've both covered the basics very beautifully. I wonder if we can kind of move on really to what happens to somebody when they actually start to take part in a clinical trial. Alison, I wonder if you could start us off with that.
Certainly. Well, each trial is designed a little bit differently based on the best approach to testing the product. As Nadia indicated, depending on what's being tested, there are many different ways that it can be done. But all trials will have some of the same components. So for example, for any trial, a participant should expect to be asked to participate in what's called an informed consent process. And this process occurs between the research participant and their study team. And it's a time to describe the overall trial to the potential participant. Things like how many visits, what will happen at each visit, can anything be done remotely, how long will the trial last, what are the chances of me receiving the active drug versus a placebo, what will my data be used for? So any questions you can think of get answered during that informed consent process. So once consented, the potential participant will go through a second step of a screening process to ensure all eligibility requirements for the participation are met. And then you can finally start participating. The eligibility requirements will be listed in the study documents and will most likely include such things as maybe the time that has passed since the onset of symptoms. So for example, that eligibility requirement may be listed as must be within 3 years of symptom onset. So during the screening process, you would expect to be asked a question like, how long has it been since the start of your symptoms? So once you're accepted into a trial, you'll work very closely with the study team at that trial site, and that will be the group of people that will guide you through every step of the trial from that point forward.
Thank you. Paula, do you think you can give us a kind of a personal perspective?
Yeah, so a lot of what Alison said, you go through that informed consent process, you find out exactly what the trial is going to be like, what exactly you'll be doing at each appointment. And then when you're actually participating in the clinical trial, you're going to that facility, or sometimes it's online, some of the questions that you can do. And for the clinical trial component itself, I'll go through a whole bunch of testing first. There might be testing my muscle strength, my breathing. They might do some blood work. For me, because I'm a female, they don't want me to be pregnant or lactating. So, I might have to do a pregnancy test just before I get treatment to make sure that's not going to affect baby. And then once all that testing has been done, you might even see a doctor, then you're actually going to receive the treatment. And then afterwards, there's often a time of observation period that might be included as well. And as you move through the clinical trial, maybe after, if you go on to open label extension, all that testing that they do at every appointment might actually become less. And they might do it, every 3 months instead of every appointment or something. So yeah, it's really interesting. one of the benefits of participating in the clinical trial, you get to meet the researchers and the staff, which is really great. It sure gives me a sense of hope that there are people that actually do care, and they are, rooting for you. They're hoping it's going to work. And it's really exciting to see where it goes in the end.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think, Alison, do you think, can people requalify for a second trial once one's finished?
Yes, absolutely. I just want to say though, Paula, I want to point out how amazing it is that you've been going through so many phases of this trial and have stuck with it. That's such a commitment. So thank you for doing that and putting yourself through all those pregnancy tests. It's still stressful at our age. You never get over that. But thank you. But yes, absolutely. People can requalify for other trials because the eligibility requirements are documented and available for every single trial. So if you meet the eligibility requirements, there's no reason you can't participate in as many trials as you are interested in. However, having said that, what you do need to be aware of is that because these are very specific experiments, right? Trial eligibility can include such things as not taking over-the-counter supplements, not utilizing other experimental therapies, and things like that. So there's only a very slight chance in reality that you'd be able to participate in more than one trial at the same time. And after completing a trial, there may actually be a washout period where that experimental therapy needs to completely leave your body before starting another trial. And in some cases, having utilized potential therapies such as stem cells may disqualify you from further trials. So this is kind of a good problem to have, right? Because it means there are choices, but it also really stresses the importance of carefully reading through trial eligibility criteria for all trials that you may be interested in and talking through your decisions with your care team.
Oh, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. Kind of the next question I'd like to ask you is if you can talk about some of the misconceptions, including about entering a trial, including kind of why does a trial take so long? Nadia, can I ask you that question first?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So it does take some time to run a clinical trial because it is a very complicated experiment that involves people, and there has to be safety, there has to be enrollment, and it takes time to fully enroll a clinical trial. It takes time to measure all of the things that we want to do in a clinical trial. But there are a lot of innovations that are happening. So now around the world, we're lucky to have platform trials. So platform trials, the neat thing about platform trials is that they set up an infrastructure, right? They set up a way for a trial to go on continuously. And in the US, we have the Healy platform trial. In the UK, there's another platform trial called MND Smart. And in Europe and Australia, there's another platform trial called Magnet through the TriCals Consortium. And so these trials are creating that infrastructure to continuously run. So if once one drug is tested and completed, they can bring in another drug and test that very easily. They could test multiple drugs at the same time. And that really helps to expedite the clinical trial process for everybody. Another thing to consider is that their trial design has evolved a lot in the last few years. So we're having more clever trial designs too. There are trials where there might be different cohorts or groups of participants. And so somebody might come into a clinical trial at first where it is measuring dosing, and they might continue to get the treatment, but then there may be additional cohorts that are added on where they can, now that they've understood the dosing and the safety of the drug a little bit, they can start measuring the effects of the drug. And that can all happen within a single trial now. So there are a lot more innovative trial designs. Like we are starting to move past, let's just answer this one main question with this one trial and then break it down and then create another trial. So those are some of the things that are helping things to move faster.
Certainly sounds a lot more complex as we get more experience. I wonder, Alison, could you add anything to that?
Sure. Further to what Nadia said, I think we all know that it's very frustrating to know how long it takes for clinical trials and waiting for that readout and the results. That's really difficult. But I think one of the most difficult misconceptions that I talk about with people impacted by ALS and trying to find their way through clinical research is what's called the therapeutic misconception. And while you're waiting, you're so hopeful about that treatment and you think that it's going to work and I need to get into that trial and I need to know if it works. And I know from personal experience how willing people with ALS are to try anything that may help slow disease progression. But the truth is, trials are experiments and nobody knows if they will help or not. In fact, nobody knows for sure if they'll cause harm or not. And that's why trials in humans are so highly regulated and done in phases, and the time is taken to do them correctly. And sometimes we see information on the internet where people claim to know that something will work. But the truth is, until it's proven in a controlled clinical trial, there isn't anyone who could possibly know that. And that's why it's a good idea to ask a lot of questions when selecting a trial to participate in. Understand the scientific thinking that was behind the design of the trial and the investigational drug or treatment being tested. What is it supposed to do and how is it suspected it will do that? Will I feel differently if it's working, or is it happening at a cellular level that I won't know? Any questions you can think of, ask the study team so you enter the trial with very clear expectations.
Oh, that's really good top tips. And I want just going to ask Paula really, and then Nadia and Alison, what your main considerations were or are when you enter a trial. What are you thinking about?
The biggest one is it going to suit your lifestyle? You know, for me, I was quite young when I was diagnosed. So a big thing is, are my husband and I going to have any more children? Was that a plan? Luckily, we were done. When I was first diagnosed, I was still breastfeeding. So at that time, it wasn't suitable for me to start a clinical trial until I had stopped breastfeeding. So once I had stopped, then I was able to start joining clinical trials. You know, more to the lifestyle, you know, are you going to be able to work it around, say, your work or your extracurricular activities, right? Sometimes some trials require infusions where you have to sit there for hours. Can you afford that time? Or for me, it was another travel consideration. I didn't have any trials in my area. So was I able to, you know, dedicate myself to the time it takes to go travel somewhere else and come back? And like I said, for activities, for my trial, it was an intrathecal injection through my spine. So there is about a week afterwards where I have to be very gentle with my body and I can't be pushing myself too much to avoid some side effects. And so am I able to take that time to do that? And I'm very lucky I don't have, say, a very physical manual labor job that would affect that type of thing.
Oh no, that's really interesting. I wonder if we could go to Nadia.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, kind of building on what Paula was saying, right? When you're considering joining a clinical trial, you know, it's important to consider what your priorities are when you're choosing a trial. And that could mean, you know, what's the location of the trial? How hard will it be to get there? How many in-person visits are there? Will you be able to continue accessing the drug after the clinical trial? Does that matter to you? Does it matter to you what your chances are of being on placebo? And so I think it's really important to prioritize those things and then try to find a trial that fits your priorities. And to understand that there is some burden as well to participating in clinical research. It's an incredible gift to give to the community, to share your information and to participate in the process that might hopefully develop new treatments for us. But it can bring on challenges as well. And I think it's important to go in, you know, aware of those things. There can be side effects from drugs. And it is, and unproven drugs can have unknown side effects, right? So there's a lot of things to consider, and it's really important to think about this from many different perspectives before you choose to participate in a clinical trial.
No, I agree. I kind of ask Alison.
Yes and yes to everything Paula and Nadia said. Such good advice when considering accessing a clinical trial. I would add, if you're in an area that has availability to participate in clinical trials, there's a pretty good chance that there may be multiple options to learn about. And the reason for this is that the infrastructure for clinical trials is different than the infrastructure for clinical care. So if the infrastructure exists to handle clinical trials in a certain location, most likely there's more than one trial being conducted there. So if this is the case, I think it would be really important to understand the details of each trial, like Paula and Nadia went through, so that you can consider all of your options. And one thing I would also consider as a caregiver, I also carried the weight of the requirements of any clinical trials that we would participate in. So it's important that the trial experience is positive for you. And it's also very important for the study overall that you complete the entire trial. So take the time to select the right trial for both you and your family.
Oh no, that's really good advice. Just thinking, and actually Paula touched on it already really, about what happens and what are the considerations if there isn't a trial in my area. And what do you think I should do with that, Alison?
So this is such a hard topic, and I deal with it every day at the Healy Center. People call from all over the world trying to gain access to clinical research. And there really are quite a few things to consider if you're looking to possibly participate in a trial outside of your geographical area. So as I shared, I know from my own personal experience, I would have traveled anywhere with my husband to access any kind of hope. But as it turns out, that's not actually so easy to do. There are language barriers, different rules and regulations by country, different rules by site even, travel and accommodation costs, insurance issues. Like what happens if something happens and you're admitted to a hospital when you're away from home and away from your family? It's a very difficult truth, but the truth is clinical trials are unfortunately not available everywhere. But there are a couple of things I can think of to consider when thinking about clinical trials. First, trials are done on behalf of all. So even if you cannot physically participate in the trial, or you even choose not to participate in a clinical trial, which is okay too, the trial is still occurring for your disease and the answers will still be known for your disease. So the knowledge learned from clinical trials benefits all, whether you're actually able to choose to participate or you choose not to participate. But in addition, I don't think we need any hard stops in ALS, right? We shouldn't be talking about what we can't do. We shouldn't just say, no, it's not available. We should find the yeses or what we can do. So there are a lot of ways to participate in clinical research without actually being a participant in the trial. You may choose to join advocacy groups or support groups and bring your skills as a person, combine it with your lived experience and bring it into the science community, not just your disease. And those opportunities transcend a lot of barriers, thanks to things such as the internet and social media. We can come together as a global community and work together on global projects that give us all a sense of purpose and also contribute to science.
I really love that, the thoughts, how you can participate without actually being there in person. I think that's really wonderful. Nadia, what do you think?
So I think I'm going to go back to the same point I keep bringing up over and over again and talk a little bit about biomarker studies. So for people who cannot participate in a clinical trial because there's no access, there are other ways to participate in research that also drives the science forward and that are absolutely necessary. There are studies that can evaluate, that look for biomarkers that can track somebody's progression. So ALS TDI, the organization that I work for, has an ongoing natural history study that people can participate in from home. And we've had signups from over 50 countries and participants from over 30 countries around the world. And in this kind of a study, we track how people progress. We ask information about where you live. There might be surveys to fill out. There might be questions about your progression of your ALS. Depending on what parts of the study you're eligible for. There's even things like blood collection or tracking movement and speech. And people don't need to participate in every single aspect of a study like this. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to be involved in, but any data that you can share in a study like this is extremely helpful, because that is how we're going to get to some of these biomarkers that are going to help us figure out, an ALS diagnosis earlier, that will help us figure out how to match a drug to a person who's living with ALS. There are so many different types of biomarkers, but these are the types of studies that would help us figure out what those are.
That's really interesting. Thank you. And I just noticed that Jessica's put the link up in the chat to that if anybody's interested in that. Now, leading on to my next question for Nadia and Alison, what would you say are the warning signs, something that I need to look out for if I'm considering alternative therapies or publications?
So
Nadia, sorry, thank you.
All good. So Dr. Richard Bedlack at Duke University in the US put together a great publication through ALS Untangled, and Allison and I thought it would be good to share some of those points with people. And so some of the things to consider are, is there a large out-of-pocket cost? Is this going to be something that's very costly? And for something that's unproven, that can be a real challenge. ALS is a costly disease as it is. Another thing is when you're looking at an alternative treatment, is it being advertised as being effective for multiple incurable conditions that have different causes? It is unlikely that there is going to be one, herbal treatment, for example, that might cure many different diseases, because there's probably different underlying pathology for all of those different diseases. A third thing to consider is lack of safety and scientific oversight. So if we don't have clear safety information, if there is not strong research behind it, that can be a red flag to move away from that alternative option. A couple of other things. An absent or limited informed consent process. So informed consent, which we touched on a little bit today, is a process that walks somebody through risks, benefits, and alternatives of participating in a trial or accessing a treatment. And if that information is not available, that is kind of a warning signal. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the lack of an evidenced mechanism by which the intervention might help. So that is, if we don't really know how a particular alternative treatment, if there's not a clear mechanism to understand why it might treat a disease like ALS, that might be a good reason to avoid it or stay away from it.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you. Alison, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sure. As Nadia said, we wanted to share a little bit about the ALS Untangled review, and this is actually called, I think, the 10 red flags. That's how you can find it on the ALS Untangled site. So Nadia hit on some of those. I'm going to try to hit on the others. Hopefully I get the right ones here. First one being absence of regularly measured validated outcomes. So legitimate researchers want to see how their products perform in terms of effectiveness and safety. So they'll ask patients to take tests or outcomes measured at regular intervals. The best outcomes have been validated, or in other words, they've been proven to measure something meaningful. An example of a validated outcome measure in ALS might be the ALS-FRS-R, the ALS Functional Rating Scale revised, which is universally available and quickly administered. The next red flag is if there's vague or no plan to present those outcomes for peer review. So mainstream researchers share the results at meetings or in publications, and in doing so, they give others in the field a chance to critique it. This is called peer review. We all hear about peer review and has always been one of the fundamentals of good science, as well as being a humanitarian reason, because someone who has really discovered something that helps patients should want their technique to be adopted and widely used, right? So the next red flag is the only evidence that is shown is anecdotes. So many different alternative therapies claim to benefit people with ALS, and the most common proof of such benefit is called an anecdote. And anecdotes are stories of people who tried something and then they experienced this great positive effect that they attributed to it. And there's several problems with that in ALS. First, it can be really difficult to prove that a quoted anecdote even represents a real person. There are examples of companies having fabricated those to sell their products. It's even more difficult to prove that that person in that anecdote had ALS, and it's even more difficult than that to prove that something important actually changed in them in an objective way. So we have to be very careful of those. Second to last one, proponents have no relevant training or presentations or publications. So when someone has no medical or scientific training or none that's applicable to ALS specifically, and no record of ever presenting or publishing anything relevant, it's pretty less likely that they will have discovered something useful for ALS. And this could be very clear or it could be subtle. It's really hard to know because oftentimes these people speak with authority and they say things that we really, really want to be true. So I just encourage everybody to check your sources because scientists will always be the best at interpreting science. And finally, the last red flag I want to bring up is proponents portray themselves as victims, and oftentimes they actually advise people to kind of divorce yourself from the mainstream doctors. And there are published writings by people claiming a vast conspiracy theories amongst doctors and nonprofits, pharmaceutical companies, and the government saying that they're trying to withhold information or treatments that could help people with ALS. And I'm not aware of any credible evidence of those conspiracies existing. And in fact, from what I understand, they're not even plausible. They're like movies. So the scientific method that's used is really straightforward. You make an observation, you come up with a theory about it, you design good experiments or clinical trials to test your theory, you interpret the results, you report on the results in a meeting or journal where a peer review takes place. So according to the team at ALS Untangled, there's not yet been any product found that bypassed this pathway and was actually useful for patients with ALS.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for that, for answering that question so incredibly informatively. And Kathy and Jess have put up the links to Untangled and the red flags in the chat if anybody likes further reading. Before we go on to the question and answer session, I'd like to ask you all, starting with Paula, what would your top recommendation be for even considering to go into a clinical trial?
Number one recommendation, look and see what is in your area. You know, quite often, a lot of people don't realize that there are clinical trials going across North America that they can participate in close to them. You know, so do that first before seeking out those big centers. And the next, really look for the trials that suit your priorities, suit your lifestyle, right? Make sure that you are able to see them through to completion. Make sure you understand them, you know, the time commitments and whatnot. I think those two keys are the biggest ones before you start getting into a clinical trial.
Thank you, Paula. How about Alison?
Well, I think my top recommendation, it might sound kind of silly, but I would recommend that when you're looking for a clinical trial, you use the same mindset as when you're interviewing for a job. It isn't just the company looking for the right person, it's the person looking for the right job, right? So educate yourself, find information from legitimate sources, talk to your care team before you make a decision, and make the decisions that are best for you and your family.
That's really, really good advice. And Nadia?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective here. You know, ALS is such a terrible and challenging disease. And I would say to people that there's so much angst associated with ALS, and that this burden of worrying about getting into a clinical trial shouldn't add to that, right? So if there isn't a clinical trial available in your area, you know, there are other ways to participate in research, but try not to have that guilt or worry over not being able to participate in a clinical trial. Many people around the world don't have access, and that's not ideal. We definitely need to find ways to bring more trials, but trials are unproven. And so there shouldn't be guilt around not being able to participate. There shouldn't be additional worry on top of the worries we already have when we're facing ALS.
Thank you. I think that's really kind of sound advice from all of you. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for answering all my questions. I noticed there are questions for you, which I'd rather you answer than me, because some of them are quite challenging. The first question that's been asked is, how would you work out statistically the different types of ALS progression with different backgrounds, from sporadic to genetic cases? Nadia, you're nodding your head, so I'll ask you that question.
We need massive amounts of data, right? And so that's why it's so important for these natural history studies or for biomarker studies. The size of the study is really important. I keep likening it to, sometimes when you're at the beach and you see people with a metal detector looking for something in the sand. That's kind of what it's like to find a biomarker, right? Where we don't know what we're looking for. And so the more people that we have who can share their data so that we can look for these things, the better it is. The more likely we are to find patterns then. We need to find those patterns in groups of people to be able to find those biomarkers and to have the statistics work out.
Thank you. Alison and Paula, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's such a tough question, and there are actually biostatisticians who spend their life trying to answer that question. So thank you, Nadia, for jumping in and answering that.
No, it's a toughie. The next question that was asked is, where should I look up the clinical trials that are happening so that I make sure that I'm accessing reliable information? Alison, you are nodding on that one.
So there are a few sources. Clinicaltrials.gov for us is the main source, and all clinical trials are required to register and put information on clinicaltrials.gov in the United States, at least. So that is the main source. Now that information can be really hard to work through and find what you're looking for. So there may be some other sources that are a front end to using that clinical trials data. There is one on neals.org. There's a clinical trial search engine. IMALS has a clinical trial search engine, and ALS TDI has a search engine that shows you recruiting clinical trials as well.
Thank you for that. Anything to add to that question? Thank you, Alison. Then I have another question that which is really interesting, and it's saying, if I had a bad side effect from a clinical trial, will that affect me getting into another trial in the future? I can open that to anybody. Alison.
Yes, I answer this question often through the Healy Center, and no, it won't necessarily preclude you from other trials. As we talked about, eligibility requirements for each trial are different. So will it preclude you from something that may cause that same effect? Yes, because we already know you've had an adverse reaction to that, but it won't stop you from participating in clinical research.
Lovely, thank you. Nadia or Paula, do you have anything to add? No? Okay, I have one final question, and then we can hand back to Kathy. And it says, everybody's touched on how clinical trial design impacts access. What are the key elements that will increase access globally? This is putting you to the test today. Alison, can I ask you that?
Yeah, of course. I think from my perspective, where I see the biggest change coming that will expand access is twofold. The first is obviously funding, because as we talked about, there's an infrastructure that needs to be set up. It's not just the creation of the experimental treatment, it's the team to support going through the clinical trial. So funding is critical. But secondarily to that, there are so many new digital ways of collecting outcome measures and doing remote information. So I think remote studies through digital measurement tools is the wave of the future and will expand the breadth dramatically of how many people can participate in clinical research.
Thank you. Nadia, do you have anything to add?
So there, some of these larger consortia that exist now, right? Like NEALS, like TRICALS, like these are really, really helpful for creating larger trial networks. And I think those are going to be critical in bringing clinical trials to more regions of the world. And yes, to everything Allison said, right? There's much more awareness. We're a much more global community. Overall, there's a lot that can be done remotely, and I think those things are all going to help. But really, it's getting clinicians on the ground who are ready to run these trials in more remote areas and take that challenge on. I think that's going to be the biggest thing.
That's really, really important. Paula, do you have any kind of thoughts about that?
Yeah, so here in Canada, I know this is an issue too, where infrastructure is missing. We don't always have sites everywhere that can handle clinical trials. Another big one is, again, not having that staff, having the ALS neurologists that we have been trained. And I think there needs to be more emphasis, globally, of helping anybody who's interested in ALS to become a neurologist, to become the host of clinical trials. And so there's a lot of funding that has to go in to help those people out to get them to that point.
Thank you for that. I think we've got kind of a few more minutes. There's one more question here, and it's as a trustee considering funding applications, what would you expect as the key items on board that they look at for funding requests on a trial that a trial is presented?
Rachel, just so I understand the question, was the question, what do funders look for in a trial when deciding to fund the trial?
Yeah.
I think that is very diverse as well. It depends on the funding source. For example, there are philanthropic groups who really focus on perhaps like genetic testing. So they're looking for the genetic component for what they fund, where in our CDMRP, our congressionally directed medical research program in the United States, they're looking for high risk, high benefit. These are the things that a lot of other people may not want to fund. So I think it's really dependent on who the funder is and what their individual goals are.
Yeah, thank you. Nadia or Paula, any final thoughts?
No, I'm really grateful to anybody that participates in clinical research. I'm glad that Allison was here to handle some of those difficult questions, and I'm glad Paula was here to share her perspectives from actually participating in clinical research. But this is how we're going to get new drugs for ALS, right? There's no other way to do it. So I'm grateful to all that participate.
Thank you. And I have to say, kind of from a slightly outsider's perspective, all the way in England, when I first started looking after people with MND, clinical trials were not even a kind of thought about or a possibility or a conception. Now we're talking about choosing which trial you go on. I mean, has the world, we've just kind of come so far in what's kind of a relatively short period of time, I think, in terms of kind of just working and finding and thinking about a cure. So what's left for me to do is to thank Alison, Nadia, and Paula very much for your expertise and fascinating insight into trials and trial design. And I think I've learned a lot. So thank you for that. And I wonder if I can now hand back to Kathy for her final comments. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for your fantastic moderation, and a special thank you to Nadia, Allison, and Paula for contributing your expertise and really helping us out with clinical trials today. I'm just going to look at my notes for a sec because I jotted something down as Nadia said it, which is it's a gift when the community when someone chooses to participate in a clinical trial. And I couldn't agree more. So special thanks to Paula for sharing your experiences today as a representative of someone who is participating in a clinical trial. And, everyone, a special thanks to everyone who is listening now or who may be listening in the future to this recording for that gift that you're giving to the community, because I believe very strongly in what Nadia said, that that is the only way we're going to change the future is through the participation of those in clinical trials. So thank you also to Biogen for supporting our webinar series, and a huge thank you message of gratitude to all of our speakers today. I should note that I particularly loved the section of the webinar where you were, rather than looking at non-participation as a problem, you turned that around and looked at it as an opportunity for other participation, other elements that people could participate in. And I really liked that kind of approach of getting to yes instead of staying with no. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.